So in 2003, I started ISGAP. Professor Elie Wiesel was our first president. I started it with him. He organized a conference at the United Nations with Kofi Annan when he was the Secretary General. And it was the first program at the United Nations on issues of anti-Semitism. And that was in 2003. So it took the United Nations. The United Nations was literally born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And it took until 2003 for the first program on anti-Semitism. That was thanks to Kofi Annan and his work with Elie Wiesel. And at this conference, there's a small group of scholars that were concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism. So we started a study group, and it evolved into ISGAP. So ISGAP was created as a non-profit organization in the United States. And then we created an entity in Canada, the UK, the European Union, and in Israel. Natan Sharansky, who was a very important human rights activist in the Soviet Union, is currently our chair. And we also have a small research center that's developing at Cambridge University. It took 2 fellows because they were nervous about the study of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is perceived increasingly in academia as something as racist, as supporting apartheid, as right-wing, and as not scholarship, but advocacy. So they took a chance with ISGAP, and Lev and Chloe Pinto and myself, I guess, through our work, has convinced them that we are not all white supremacist, fascist, apartheid supporters, but this is how the study of anti-Semitism is often portrayed and perceived by academics. The reason why we chose working in Oxford in the United Kingdom is that, I'd say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Europe was really the center of anti-Semitism, or the re-emergence of anti-Semitism, particularly in France and the UK. And I understood, for reasons which I'll explain briefly tonight and tomorrow in my lecture, that anti-Semitism was going to be, it was becoming exacerbated by the global situation, and that it was going to increase. And the wave of anti-Semitism from Western Europe has sort of come into Canada and the United States now, and we knew it was coming, and I'll explain why. So we were trying to bring scholars from around the world to the UK to look at what was happening here on the ground. So we were trying to bring scholars to Oxford, and we brought all these experts, Joel was here and some other scholars, teaching professors about the rise of contemporary anti-Semitism. And many of the professors during the first week perceived this issue as being kind of Zionist advocacy, that there really wasn't anti-Semitism, it disappeared after the Holocaust magically, but that we were defending the apartheid racist problematic entity, and we were advocates and not scholars. And we had this in the classroom. And we have this for the first week. The second week would bring them to the Community Security Trust, which you'll visit on Monday. The Community Security Trust is probably the preeminent organization that defends or secures the Jewish community of the United Kingdom. They are responsible for safeguarding every physically safeguarding every Jewish high school, synagogue, and neighborhood. And they're plugged into the local police and also the national police, the MI5, Scotland Yard, and other organizations. And you'll see they have a situation room where the entire community or communities in the United Kingdom is wired into this Community Security Trust headquarters. And it's only then when these progressive, postmodern scholars would actually see how the Jewish community of a great democracy, a great city like London, right, a very important international democratic society, that the Community Security Trust has to physically defend the Jewish community from white nationalists and skinheads, by Islamists, by radical anarchists. And it was only then that, we would show these professors like what is really happening on the ground to a Jewish community in a Western liberal democracy. And it's only then that the light bulb started to go off, and they began to realize that anti-Semitism didn't go away with the end of the Holocaust, but it's still deeply rooted in our societies. And this is what we try to unpack. I'll explain tomorrow how I came to this issue. So I was, you'll see in my biography, I was a scholar, but also a human rights advocate fighting against apartheid when it still existed on campus. I'll never forget going to McGill University, where I took a course with Professor Sam Newmoff, a professor from New York City, Jewish guy who was a Leninist. And he used to wear safari suits, and he used to have a cigarette holder, and he used to give us classes called Comparative Revolution. He was a character, but a great teacher. And he gave a lecture on apartheid in South Africa, and I was like 19 years old. And I went up to him afterwards, after the class, and I said, when did apartheid end? And he laughed at me. And he said, it didn't end. So I said naively, I said, well, when will it end? And he said, I don't know. I said, the regime is still deeply entrenched in South Africa. So, to realize that a regime that is deeply connected philosophically, scientifically, theologically to Nazism was still alive and well in my lifetime was a shock, right? So this ideology of defining groups of people in a particular way for the benefit of other groups of people is still alive and well. So I was a sort of progressive human rights guy, got involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and through that, as I told you, I met my mentor. I go off to Oxford and study here. And I was looking at issues of cultural identity and globalization, the impact of neoliberal globalization on culture and on societies. And I started reading Arabic, as the internet was developing in the 90s, I started reading a lot of Egyptian newspapers that were available in English. And my Arabic is not good enough. But I was reading the words of Muslim Brotherhood intellectuals, Yasser Arafat, and political leaders of the day that were speaking in European languages in one way, and then they were speaking in Arabic in another way. And I started to realize that the Muslim Brotherhood, right, which is, you'll hear about it all week from different experts, but they play a very important political, ideological role in many societies, including the United States, as we'll unpack in our work. And that this ideology, or this political social movement, or reactionary social movement, puts together European anti-Semitism and even Nazism with a very particular understanding of Islam. All right? So political Islam is not Islam, it's not Muslims. It's a reactionary social movement that takes European anti-Semitism and Islam and sort of fuses it together as a reaction to British colonialism to get rid of the British colonial powers in Egypt. It emerges in Egypt 100 years ago. So like my naivete back in the day when I couldn't believe that apartheid existed in my lifetime, here I was reading about a social movement that takes Nazism and European anti-Semitism and fuses it with a very narrow understanding of religion, of Islam, and is the engine that's propelling a reaction to regimes in the Middle East. It's the foundational ideology of the Palestinian national movement, Hamas, but also the PLO, and starting to realize that this legacy of ideas exists. And then I'm studying this, I'm learning about this, and started writing papers about it. And then I was invited by my comrades, right? Because I studied in England, I had all these, fellow students and professors, and we were, fighting apartheid together and writing about issues of racism and anti-Semitism together. So I was invited to the Tate Gallery. One of my comrades, was the first black curator of the Tate Gallery, and he had a whole program on Orientalism and race, and he invited me to speak. And, you know, I came happily along, tracing the European racist and anti-Semitic and even Nazi ideology to the Muslim Brotherhood. And I figured my comrades who were involved in the struggle against apartheid and supporting a social democratic revolution in South Africa to rid the apartheid racist regime with the social democracy of the ANC and other groups that were fighting apartheid. These were social democrats expanding notions of democracy and citizenship to all citizens of South Africa, not just white people, not to segregate people, that we were all struggling for a democracy. That's why I joined the anti-apartheid movement. So I started getting into this stuff at the presentation at the Tate Gallery, and I actually needed a police escort to take me out of there, literally. And my comrades stopped, except for one person, stopped speaking to me because I was a Zionist, and they didn't realize that I was that type of Jew. Okay, so I still speak to one friend. We argue and debate in the best of tradition of scholarship. We disagree on many issues, but he's a friend and he's a scholar, so we debate ideas. And I think this shock, you know, Raymond Aron, the great sociologist from France, says that in every generation the Jews are mugged. We have these ideas, these philosophies, and every generation we're mugged. So here I was, a social democrat, a human rights advocate, exposing the connections between the Muslim Brotherhood and the protocols of the Elders of Zion, for example. And Elie Wiesel, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, very important professor on these issues. I'm sure many of you have come across his work. You know, he always argued that, first of all, that anti-Semitism is not a parochial Jewish or Israeli problem. That once anti-Semitism is unleashed in the world, it knows no boundaries. And that it's a vicious form of hatred. It's like a virus. And once it's unleashed, other groups will be affected by this form of hatred. So it's not a parochial problem. And he also, you know, always used to teach that words and ideas, the words and ideas created the Holocaust. The Holocaust didn't begin with the railroad tracks and the crematoriums. It began with words and ideas. And the words and ideas of the protocols of the Elders of Zion that spoke about all these conspiracies about Jews and Jewish power. And, you know, you'll hear more about it during the next 2 weeks. That it was the words and ideas that created the Holocaust. And these words and ideas are still alive and well today. They are promoted by the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots of political Islamist organizations. And in this sort of postmodern space of progressive intellectuals, or apparently progressive intellectuals, who try to oppose notions of Western hegemony and the power of the West over the colonized rest, that they are at one level opposed to Western domination, and there's merit in that. We can speak about that later. But there's sort of, we call this the red-green alliance, that progressive, feminists, gay, minorities, intellectuals who are opposed to Western hegemony actually are in bed with the other advocates of ending Western hegemony, mainly these sort of reactionary social movements in the Middle East and North Africa, and even in the West. But this is sort of the red-green alliance. In the name of anti-Western hegemony, you have this strange alliance of progressive, in quotations, postmodernists, and reactionary social forces. And the only thing, in my view, that they have in common is their notion of anti-Western hegemony and their anti-Semitism. And it's the anti-Semitism of these reactionary social forces that I would argue, is at the forefront of contemporary anti-Semitism, and they're re-emerging because of the crisis in neoliberal globalization, which I'll speak about tomorrow. So the conditions are ripe for these very different social movements, or sort of have this alliance, the red-green alliance, in which anti-Semitism is at its core. So, and then of course there's the right-wing anti-Semitism, the Nazis that were mentioned, and the white supremacists, and the nationalists, which also are attacking the center in the United States, in Europe, and other places. So you have these three extreme movements that are attacking the center, and I think are gaining credibility because of the crisis that exists in the global economy, and as a result in the states and institutions that held society together for a long time. So you have the extreme Islamists, you have the white supremacists that are emerging, and you have the sort of postmodern intellectuals that are in the institutions in which we function. So I know in Colorado, you give an example of fascists going to school, but most fascists aren't in the classroom. They may show up on campus here and there, but it's the dehumanization of who Jews are, of what Israel is, and what Jewish peoplehood is, that is being attacked in our sort of liberal intellectual spaces of our best educational institutions and in the media of record. And this, to me, is the challenge of us as intellectuals, as scholars, as professors. How do we operate in this space that is increasingly hostile to Jewish faculty and to Jewish students? How do we as intellectuals come up with a response? How do we map and decode and understand the processes which are being kind of laid out in front of us? How do we respond intellectually? And how do we respond, I'd say as active intellectuals? During the anti-apartheid movement, I was operating with amazing professors and intellectuals and graduate students and undergraduate students fighting apartheid, and we were acting with the best legacy, if you will, of what it means to be an intellectual, to engage society, to stand up for what is right, to stand against racism, to stand against exclusion, to stand against the dehumanization of groups of people. And yet it's the intellectuals that are in bed with the Islamists. I'm not saying about Muslims, I'm not saying, or Islam, but political Islam, the Islamists. So when Princeton University, I just found out, is having a course that dehumanizes Israel, right? Who are they supporting? When Judith Butler stands up and says that we have to understand Hezbollah and Hamas as being part of the progressive global left, what is she speaking about? How can a reactionary social movement of Hezbollah and Hamas that literally plagiarize from the protocols of the elders of Zion, they plagiarize. If they were in my class, I'd kick them out of the school for plagiarism. They plagiarize the protocols of the elders of Zion and speak about Jews and Israel in the most genocidal ways. The protocols lay the foundation of the Holocaust. They lay the foundation of excluding Jews from institutions. They lay the foundation of explaining why Jews should be forcibly put into ghettos. They lay the intellectual foundations of explaining why Jews should be put on trains and moved to labor camps, to concentration camps, and ultimately in the final solution. This is the crap that is being peddled in social movements from South Africa to the United States, to Europe. And it's being echoed in our best universities. So, if Israel is an apartheid state, then from a liberal, intellectual, human rights, postmodern, progressive position, Israel must be dismantled. Because if Israel is an apartheid state, it's a crime against humanity. So when these intellectuals parade themselves and say Israel's an apartheid state, then from a liberal human rights perspective, we're obligated to dismantle it. So the self-determination of the Jewish people on their homeland doesn't exist. And this is in Princeton, this is in Oxford, it's at the Sorbonne. It's our best university. And this is what's at stake. And it's frightening. In 1983, Edward Said said that he's the last remaining Jewish intellectual. The Palestinians are the Jews and the Israelis are the Nazis. And that he is the inheritor of Adorno and Horkheimer, of their intellectual legacy, and he's the last Jewish intellectual, and the American Jewish scholars have become fat scribes in the suburbs of America. Now, in 1983, to say he's the last Jewish intellectual, it was outrageous. It was ridiculous. It didn't make sense. In 2023, it makes sense. Intellectuals are teaching that the Israelis are the Nazis, the Jews are white supremacists, and that the Palestinians are the oppressed Jewish people and need to be liberated against fascism and against apartheid. This is inversion theory. This is deeply connected to the anti-Semitism of the church. Think about it. This is replacement theology. And this is why, in my humble opinion, it goes so deep and resonates so powerfully in Western society, in Western Christian society, that has been rooted in anti-Semitism, of replacement theology, that the stubborn Jew still exists and needs to be replaced by the church, by the new covenant. Said, a Christian person from the region, is saying that he's the real authentic Jew. But my people have heard this for 2,000 years. So think about it. Think how these things resonate. So to the irrationality of hatred has to be legitimized. Right? And I'll go to my final point and then I'm going to give the floor to Joel and Marcus. But the title of this introductory talk is The Importance of Creating Contemporary Critical Anti-Semitism Studies. We know in the last 40 or 50 years there's been, thankfully, the creation of centers, of institutes, of curriculum on issues of racism. Issues of racism only became legitimate areas of study in the United States of America in the late 50s and early 60s when historians at Yale University began to recognize racism. And I'm not speaking about the historically black universities and colleges. Of course, Du Bois, and there's a whole legacy of all kinds of work that was going on in those universities, but not in the mainstream universities. Robert Park didn't talk about racism. The Chicago School of Thought banned Du Bois because he was speaking about racism, and the Chicago School of Thought was not speaking about it. It was an issue that was sort of not tolerated. So it's only in the 1960s and 70s where institutes and scholars are engaging racism and the legacy of racism, of colonialism, and how the colonialists broke people up into different groups of race, of inferiority and superiority, of the legacy of slavery in the Americas, of how language are concepts, and how concepts in our everyday speech are sometimes racist, how our cities are segregated, how our places of employment are segregated, right? So you have a liberal education today, you know stuff about racism, you know things about sexism. Now they're beginning to deal with issues of queer studies. We're learning about homophobia. And as many of you were saying earlier, today issues of anti-Semitism, the longest hatred of Western civilization. Right? We don't have the material. We have wonderful stuff on the Holocaust, tragically. We have descriptive work on contemporary anti-Semitism, but we don't have a framework to understand the language of anti-Semitism, how it causes segregation, how it causes othering, the socioeconomic, political, and cultural processes and the reemergence of anti-Semitism, the language of anti-Semitism, how Jewish students and faculty are being marginalized at our best universities and why. So if young Jewish students and faculty members are connected to Zionist, the Zionist project or Israel, they have family and friends in Israel, or they think that Jews are like other people entitled to the self-determination in their land, like other people, that somehow you're a problem. You're enemy number one in this progressive postmodern space. And it's reflective in our curriculum, it's reflective in the culture of our universities and our media of record. And I'll just end, I can go on for a long time, but I'll end by one more comment. We have this amazing woman, her name is Eliza Landau. She's a Holocaust survivor. Originally from Poland, she lives in Israel. She made it to Israel, she had a family, she had a few children, she has grandchildren now. She lives in Tel Aviv. And she tells the story of the Holocaust, of what happened to her family. So as we know, there's Christian anti-Semitism, there's racist forms of anti-Semitism, and now there's the attack on who Jews are as a people. So it's almost like the three main phases. There's theology, race, and people. It's like an onion. So there's different types of anti-Semitism. So we know the racist form of anti-Semitism during the Holocaust was permeated European society. It permeated the halls of education, the best philosophers, the best theologians, the best scientists, the scholars of eugenics, wrote about the Jews. It was the intellectuals that justified the Holocaust, that justified notions of race. Right? So we know the damage that this has caused and how racism, anti-Semitic racism, affected European Jewry. So Eliza speaks about how her brothers and sisters and father, her mother was missing at that time, were lined up by SS officers in front of a pit. And just before they were about to be shot, her father pushed her in the pit and she was saved. Everybody else was killed. She was malnourished at that time and very weak. She eventually crawled out from under the bodies and crawled to a farm. And this Polish Catholic family in a farm nursed her back to life. They hid her at great peril because anybody who was hiding Jews in those days, the entire family would be killed by the Nazis. To make a long story short, she was reunited with her mother. Her mother survived, and the two of them went to Israel where they have a family. And she speaks to us. In her lifetime, as a Jewish woman, a Jewish girl, her family was exterminated because the Jews were poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. And you can't convert, right? The scholars, the intellectuals, the scientists, the theologians believed that race was innate. Even if you master languages and master culture, if you're racially Jewish, there's no escape, you're Jewish. Every group was inherently, there's no escape, it was scientifically proven. So her family and her people and her community were exterminated for poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. They had to be eliminated to save the race. Today, in her lifetime, in her life, she is being accused of being a quintessential white supremacist, apartheid-supporting fascist. In her lifetime. And then you have these intellectual clowns at our best universities. They're clowns, defining the Jew as white. And it's not, we're white and we're very terribly sorry for what happened. As a good liberal Oxford graduate say, terribly sorry. And welcome to the club. It's terrible what happened. Welcome to the club. You're white now. No. We have now replaced the colonial, racist, fascist that ran Africa and the Americas and Asia and the Middle East for centuries. And the Jew is the quintessential epitome of what a white supremacist apartheid supporter is. And here's small Elisa Landau in her life being accused of supporting apartheid. And this is being justified not just by the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranian revolutionary regime. This is being justified by the best scholars and thinkers and philosophies at our best universities. So what do we do? This is a challenge. And this is why we are arguing at ISGAP it's essential that scholars come together and create a framework, like the study of race, like the study of sexism and gender studies, to come up with an interdisciplinary, deeply high-level scholarly language of understanding, unpacking, mapping contemporary anti-Semitism. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if this continues at our finest universities, if our best students are being schooled to think that Jews are public enemy number one, that we are white supremacists, we support the apartheid system in Israel, the future is going to be increasingly difficult. And it's up to intellectuals to grapple with these issues and come up with at least a framework to understand the processes. And not to simply describe them, but to look at how power and shifting global relations and economic, social, cultural processes are impacting on this issue. And I think it goes back to what Elie Wiesel said always, that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine. The rise of anti-Semitism is, I believe, an early warning system. It's an early warning system for the deterioration of not only democracy, but human decency. And what do we do? Some of us are obviously here, so people in this room are sensitive to this challenge. So what do we do? How do we take this up a notch and come up with comprehensive understandings? This is why we need to create a framework, like others have created frameworks, like Stuart Hall. I think he was brilliant in understanding issues of race and culture and the colonial legacy on culture. So to come up with perspectives like this. So this is our challenge. So on this note, it's my honor to introduce Joel Kotek to you. Joel, as you know, he's a senior research fellow here at ISGAP. His talk is Anti-Semitism as Conspiracy Theory from Judas Pilate, apropos of what's going on in social media. We just heard about how the Jews killed Jesus, apparently. So from Judas Pilate to COVID-19.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. So I will try to explain actually the difference between anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, etc. And I will also explain through the example of the coronavirus crisis, etc. And so the coronavirus crisis confirmed Leon Poliakov's model that in situations of uncertainties and distress that cause fear and even panic, Jews find themselves accused of being the cause. Leon Poliakov was, I would say, and still is, I would say, the most important historian on anti-Semitism, etc. And so he created a concept called causalité diabolique, diabolical causality, and to understand what is happening, what happened actually with the COVID-19 crisis, he refers to a concept that was called diabolical causality, etc. This concept makes it possible to understand why an unforeseen and disturbing phenomenon of natural origin inevitably leads to the scaffolding of conspiracy theory and this is important, of course, more than often anti-Semitic. The conspiracy emerges from an archaic mentality that intends to provide a paranoid explanatory system, but all in all reassuring. The disease cannot be a chance, but proceeds from a criminal conspiracy And in the case, as we remember, of the COVID-19, it was a kind of Judeo-Zionist plot. Of course, as we know, the Jews were not alone in the dock. There was a general increase in xenophobia as countries have closed their borders, let's remember, and for instance, Asian people were also targeted, etc. But still, the Jews were the main defendants, the first accused. An example, because I'm a collector of anti-Semitic cartoons and illustration, etc. And this is an example, that you could find on the internet, telling that it was definitely not a Chinese disease, but it was a Jewish flu, etc. And this is again, and you could find hundreds of examples of how the Jews were accused of being responsible of COVID-19, etc. And again, hi Chinese friend, etc. Well, according to your calculation, it sure looks like Israel has unleashed a bioweapon meant to teach you that they control your destiny as well, etc. And this is Al-Quds, Palestinian daily newspaper, printed in East Jerusalem, who presented coronavirus as an Israeli and United States conspiracy against Iran and, of course, against China, etc. And this is, and I can show you hundreds of examples like this. This is newspaper from Tehran, from Iran, etc. So the question is why? And of course, the question is, of course, it's obvious the Jews were always considered as the scapegoat of Western civilization, etc. And it's true that the crystallization of persecution on an individual is often associated with the phenomenon of the scapegoat, who was highlighted by René Girard, who actually made his career in California because he was not recognized in France. And what does it mean? All against one manifests itself through the process of scapegoating that allows the group to reunite against a person through the sharing of a hateful emotion. And you can say, well, why not? Actually, yes. And this is a good illustration of scapegoating, etc. This is Abel Pan, very famous illustrator, who actually finally fled Russia to go to Israel. He immigrated, and it explains it's 1915, during the war, the First World War, and you can see that France accusing Germany, Germany, Britain, Britain, Turkey, Turkey, Russian Empire, finally they all agree it's the fault of the Jews. And you can see. And this is really, exactly, this is another illustration, illustrating, the same process, but for the Second World War, before, this has been made by a very good illustrator, actually, who killed himself in 1914 when the Germans entered France. Wolf, and also he explained that, of course, everyone was pleased to design to show the Jews as being responsible of what will become the Second World War, etc. So the question is, okay, Jews as ideal scapegoat. And you can say, is it enough? And you can say yes and no. I think it's too simple. An example, for instance, is the fact that in France, in 1940, there were 3 million foreigners, 3 million strangers, 3 million aliens. And 10% of them were Jews, and only the Jews were targeted, even not the Gypsies. The Gypsies were put in concentration camp, but they were not delivered to the Germans. Only the Jews finally, went into the final solution, etc. And this is the same in Belgium, etc. So there is something special. So Jews were not chosen as scapegoat because they were just the other, the weak, or the different. Actually, most of the Jews in France were French. They had the French nationality. They were no foreigners. But because, and this is obvious, just because they were Jews. Not because they were weak. Because in history, we know that sometimes the Jews were not so weak, etc. So the question is, why? Because they were the cause of the evil since the 12th century. So we have to go back to, I would say, an historical explanation. Why they were chosen as scapegoat? Because, and I will explain to you, it's a kind of cultural code of Western civilization. Didn't they plot, as you're told, didn't they plot against Christ before they murder him? And this is the famous, what we call the deicide, the ultimate crime. They kill God, etc. And this is a British representation of the plot against Jesus, and you can see that the Sanhedrin, the wives of Zion, you can say, presented Jesus to Ponce Pilate, and look how the Jews looked like. And we are in the 13th century. We're not in 19th or 20th century, etc. They look, they're ugly. And look how Jesus is. Jesus looked like, I would say, an Australian surfer. He's wonderful. But he's a Jew too. And look how Ponce Pilatus, I think this is how you can call it in English, looks like. He is a Jew. He wears the Jewish hat. So anti-Semitism, as we know, is a Christian cultural code, active since the 13th century, and the main principle is blame the Jews, blame the evil Jews, etc. And this is the big difference between ordinary, if I can speak like this, racism and xenophobia. Anti-Semitism is first a demonological, how would you say, demonological accusation, etc. And again, let's go back to the Middle Age. Again, it's not a 19th century French representation. It's not a Nazi representation of the Stürmer. It's a Middle Age, medieval representation of the Jews, being in contact directly with the devil to destroy Christian society, etc. And of course, which are dedicated to go to hell at the end of the time, etc. And this is the 12th, magnifique. And this, of course, will explain the representation of the Jews during the Second World War. This is a poster of the very famous Nazi film, The Ewige Jude, and this is, of course, the German original poster and its version in Flemish for the Dutch-speaking people, Flanders and Holland, etc. And you can see how the Jews were portrayed. And this is anthropological. This is cultural, and this is the last issue of Kladderadatsch, actually who used to be an illustrative magazine created by Jews in the 19th century and who became, of course, pro-Nazi, of course, were controlled by the Nazi. And this is the last cover, and you can see Roosevelt, President of the United States, being within the hand of the Jews. But there were no more Jews in Europe. Most of them were already killed, etc. So the basic idea, the Jews are responsible for the misfortunes of the world. And so, of course, anti-Semitism doesn't speak about the Jews, but of society in crisis, or not only in crisis, in mutation. And anti-Semitism should be considered as a social disease, as an individual and collective psychosis, etc. And it's good that we have a psychiatrist who will help me to understand this. So anti-Semitism is first and of all a conspiracy theory which aims to designate the Jews as responsible for the world misfortune. And this is a very common motto that you could find hundreds, thousands of times in the 19th century, before even the birth of Adolf Hitler, saying the Juden sind unser Unglück, the Jews are responsible of, you can say, what went wrong, all the problem we have. And so Germany was defeated in the First World War. It was because of the Jews. The Dolchschloss, they were betrayed by the Jews, etc. And this is, an Austrian postcards, and you can see that how they represent the Austrian Republic. It's a Jewish republic. Ugly Jewish republic, actually, etc. So remember that the defeat was caused by the Jews. And which is this explanation of, you could also find in contemporary issues. For instance, this is a very important Turkish newspaper who said that the Jews were responsible of what? Of the Armenian genocide, with the help of the Freemason, etc. And of course, the Jews were responsible of Daesh, ISIS, etc. And this is actually funny because they show a picture of a man, I suppose, in a bar, and they pretend that he is a Jew called Sam Elliott, of course, and so it's always the same, that the Jews are controlling the world and are responsible of the misfortune. Yesterday they killed the Christ. They tried to poison Mohammed, that's the prophet, and now they are organizing on false flag, as you can see, the Syria civil war and all the attacks that were supposed to be Islamist, etc. So the difference with ordinary racism is the Jews help to explain the existence of evil. And it's important because if you believe in God and if you see the situation is not so good, despite the fact that the Christ has came to save us, you need the existence of the devil to justify the fact that, well, things doesn't go so well. And this is the importance of having Jews within society, etc. So, as I said, anti-Semitism is therefore more than just racism or xenophobia. As I said, it's a cultural code that affects even society without Jews. And of course, when I speak to my students, I would ask them, how many Jews you believe there were in Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power? And they would say millions. They would say 20%. They would say 30% of the German population, etc. As you know, they were less than 1%. They were less than 1%. And despite this, they were designated as the responsible of the misfortune of Germany, etc. And so this is of course, anti-Semitism is funny. We can laugh a lot about anti-Semitism because it's so absurd. So this is, for instance, a so-called Japanese historian who pretend that, Enola Gay, who was the bombers responsible of Hiroshima, that in fact Enola Gay means in Yiddish, kill the emperor, which is funny in a sense. As you remember, of course, Enola Gay was the name of the mother of the pilot, etc. But this exists, and he wrote a bestseller, etc. And there are 1,000 Jews in Japan. And also, as I said, I'm working on a lot of Africa and all the conflicts in the Great Lakes, Africa, etc. And there is also conspiracy theory that the Rwanda, the Tutsis, are controlled by the Zionists, etc. There is a Zionist Tutsi conspiracy to control, etc., all of Africa, etc. So, as I said, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory which aims to designate Jews as the real mass of the world. And this is a big difference with racism. Nobody will say the black or the female or the gypsies or whatsoever are controlling the world. Of course not. The Jews are, and we spoke about the protocol of the wives of Zion, etc. All this is all the covers, and you see the satanic, how the Jews are represented, etc. They're not represented as subhuman, as undermensch, untermensch, etc. But they are represented as evil, etc. Satanic people, trying to destroy what we like. And this is an example during the Second World War. It's a poster which show that the Jews and the Mason are plotting against Europe, Christian Europe, etc. And you can see on one side Stalin, communism, on the other side Winston Churchill. It means you can say what I'd say, capitalism, etc. And even today, I've been working on a quite famous American illustrator, David Dees, who actually died 2 years ago. And this man pretend that the great replacement, is a Jewish plot against and to destroy white people. It's a way for the Jews to genocide white people, etc. This is a poster, an illustration that he show. And of course, he won't speak about Jews. He will use the word Zionist because it's better to say the Zionists instead of the Jews. And you can say the Zionist Jew agenda used massive illegal immigration in US and EU to destroy the white race. And this is also a good example. You can see all the leaders. You can see Merkel. You can see David Cameron, etc., Sarkozy, and immigrants, Zionist weapon of European genocide, Zionist puppet Merkel, etc., Zionist unleashed total white race destruction. It's quite funny when you understand, of course, that it's absurd. And this is Macron, president of France, and you could see that everything is there. Macron, of course, is a puppet of the Jews. You can see he's a puppet, and is, of course, controlled by the House of Rothschild. He read the Protocol of the Wives of Zion because this is why, and he is organizing white genocide. And of course, he is a Freemason. And this is the Freemasonry, sign, etc. So everything is there, if you want. And this has been issued in June 2022. So it means last year. And actually, I will be one of the witnesses as a historian to the plot in France, in Avignon. And this was shown in Avignon, a very famous city in France. They organize the most famous theatrical festival in France. And you can see that Attali, you don't know him, is the equivalent of Soros Attali, you know, he's a Jewish liberal, etc., intellectual who used to be actually member of the Socialist Party, controlling Macron. And Macron, and he has white gloves, and white gloves, it means they were Freemasons, etc. So it's a very famous Freemason, Jewish Freemason conspiracy theory, etc. So the major difference between ordinary racism and xenophobia, the Jews are not subhuman, they are inhuman. They constitute, as Hitler would have said, a Gegenrasse. It means they are satanic, dangerous, harmful. They're not human. They compare them as a kind of microbe and therefore to be eliminated. And this is how they will represent the Jews in actually then the Nazi magazine like the Stürmer, etc., as rats, etc., mocking the Jews that, of course, the Jews wanted to leave Germany after 1938, Kristallnacht, and nobody wants them, nobody wanted to welcome them, etc. So the mockery. And then you can see also, you know, this is a, how would I say, a manual distributed not to the SS, but to the plain German soldiers. We are in 1944. Almost all the Jews were already killed in Europe. And der Jude als Weltparasit. A Jew is not someone that should be enslaved. No, it should be eliminated. And this is different between concentration camp and extermination center. You know, in Birkenau, or not in Birkenau, but let's say in Sobibor, in Treblinka, you could live only 1 hour, or maximum 1 day, because they were killed the day of the arrival, etc. And people make a confusion between concentration camp and extermination center, etc. And then you can see, look, in the eyes, you can see dollar, capitalism, and on the other one, communism, etc. So, and this another example of a book, especially, you know, written for German education. Die Juden is a Weltpest. The Jews are the pest, and those are posters. Actually, they were posted in occupied Poland. Well, and it's the same, you know. It represents that the Jews are, we say, nuisible in the pest. What do you say? Rats, microbes, lice, fleas, etc. And you can, how could you deal with those people? There's only one way: penicillin, killing, etc. And this is a poster, quite interesting. In France, of course, during the war, tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer can be cured, but not the Jews. The Jews cannot be cured. And of course, you can understand why, finally, Pétain regime did collaborate with the Germans and did send all the Jews to the concentration camp. And this also to make a bit of fun. This is a demonstration in front of the, I think, the Israeli consulate in New York, and you can see that, you know, death to all Jews. No, it's not funny? I think it's funny, which also shows the ignorance of the people who actually oppose us. Going back to Corona, a report published by Tel Aviv University found that the coronavirus pandemic has become the vector of an exceptionally intense wave of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionist propaganda, accusing Jews, Israel, and both of causing or benefiting from the virus. And I will show you some example, etc. The Jews in all are the most dangerous because the Jews is invisible like the virus, etc. And so what we call deconfinement, it means we have witnessed a deconfinement of Jews' hatred mixed with the inhibited assertion that of the worst conspiracy theory, etc. And this is a good example. The Minister of Health in France was Jewish. Actually, her father, who died 6 months ago, was a survivor of Auschwitz, the only survivor of his family. And look how she was portrayed. She was accused of being responsible of COVID-19 epidemic in France. And she doesn't look really like this. Of course, they exaggerate her nose. And of course, it reminds us of what? Of the medieval accusation, of course. So you understand that if you do not study history, you cannot understand modern anti-Semitism, etc. And this was also, it's in France, and it's not, and this was it was shown in demonstration against, the vaccination. And people say that genocide Gaulois, it means that the purpose of COVID-19 was to organize a genocide against the white race. And this is in France. The genocide of the Goyim. And this was in Nancy. This was in France, etc. This is something that I wouldn't be able to invent, because it's something which seems to be so strange. And again, like this is in America actually, in Columbus, Ohio. The real plague is the Jews. This is, if you could have seen COVID-19 under a microscope, this is what you would have found. Of course, you can see that the virus is wearing kippah. And even in Poland, and you can see it's a mixture. The Jews are responsible not only of COVID-19, but also of the rest. Homosexuality, all, the disease of, I would say, postmodern and even the genre theory, which is absurd, but this is what happened, etc. Of course, David Duke, thus President Donald Trump has coronavirus. Are Israel and the global Zionist elite up to their old tricks? You know that he was connected to the Ku Klux Klan, etc. A Palestinian newspaper who would publish the cartoons of David adapted to the mimic of the virus, etc. Zionism being, of course, the real virus destroying humanity, etc. And whatsoever. And of course, not only they create the virus, but they create it to make money. And this is, of course, Jewish capitalism, etc. That the most important thing is, and this is a British, actually, illustration, the Jews have created coronavirus just to collect money, etc. Not only to organize a genocide, but also to make money. And I think I've almost finished, etc. And of course, they will accuse in France, they would have accused Jacques Attali. In America, they would have accused Soros, who is, considered and also professors to be suspected of having created. And you can see Israeli linked Dr. Lieber, who was actually professor at Harvard University, arrested, he was never arrested, for receiving payment and smuggling biomaterial to Wuhan University. It's an absurd accusation, but it's like this. And this is in Turkey. This is Fatih Erbakan, the son of the leader of the founder of Islamic Party Refah, actually who formed Erdogan, and he said, although we lack evidence, this virus serves the objective of Zionism to reduce the population and prevent it from growing. And he said, Zionism is a 5,000 years old bacterium causing people suffering. 5,000, even the Jewish people, there's no 5,000 years, etc. existence. But it's irrational, and it's obsessional, and this makes actually the study of anti-Semitism, I would say, fascinating. Iranian thing, Iranian cartoons showing that, again, America and Israel created the virus. Again, you can see the sign of Israel state, etc., the menorah. And I finished two more, and to show, really the psychotic aspect, I would say, of anti-Semitism. It's a sermon by a Yemeni scholar who said coronavirus is part of a plan by the Jews, Israel, US to control Mecca, Medina. And he said the Saud clan is a Jewish family brought into power in order to Judaize this city. Well, how could you respond to this? You cannot. You cannot. And the same Houthi, another Houthi politician, well, there's a politician, the Jews, US are behind coronavirus pandemic. We should unite in jihad against the Jews. Enmity towards them is an identifying characteristic of Muslim. Thank you very much.